So, when Harriet asked me to do this, I didn't have a clue what I was going to talk about. And then I heard on Radio 4 an interview with a guy called Fukuyama, who some of you might remember wrote a book called The End of History, when the Soviet Union fell. The victory of the West and all that sort of thing. And he was asked, is Putin mad? Is he irrational? And his answer was, not at all. He knows what he's doing. He's quite able to think things through. You know, he's a chess champion. He's an expert chess player. He's a black belt in judo. Unless that's part of the fantasy that's been built up around him. But that's what we've been told. And I thought, that's right. What else he said was that it's not that he's mad. He simply wants different things from us. He has different purposes and different aims. Now, we might not like what those are, and I've clear, obviously, or the way he's going about it. But it reminded me of a key lesson that I took from my anthropology many years ago. It might not be what you'd expect, but it's anthropology, not the ethnography of different cultures. It is about humans. And that is that any decision and any course of action is rational in the context of the purpose that's trying to be achieved. And I think that's really, really, really important to remember, because it helps to distinguish between what's actually happening and getting caught up in our prejudices about what's actually happening. And that for me over the years has actually been, we've been talking about solid ground, through meditations. It gives me a solid ground of thinking. Thinking, is something that in psychotherapeutic circles and ecotherapeutic circles is slightly sort of marginalized. It's, oh, you're all in your head, it's the association. But actually, it's a really important partner, a companion to experience. Because if we can't think things through, then we might fall into that trap of saying, well, the facts speak for themselves. The facts of my experience speak for themselves. And they never do. That's one of the biggest fallacies in the English language. The facts speak for themselves. Because they never do. If we think that they do, then what we're doing is we're appealing to sort of unconscious or at least semi-conscious assumptions about what the facts mean, be they inner facts or outer facts. And an assumption is a theory. It's an implicit theory. It contains implicit purposes about what we're wanting to achieve. And it shuts out and denies a kind of conscious thinking through, a conscious engagement. I have this acronym I use with students and clients, which is HAGLY, Hagly. Have a good look yourself. Don't take anyone's notice for anyone's opinion for it. There's a phrase there. Anyone's word for it. Think it through for yourself, because that's what the people who have really brought new ways of thinking about things into our world have done. They haven't been followers of other people's thoughts. They might have drawn on other people's thinking to make sense of their own questions and hypotheses, but they're driven by questions. And I think this is so important. Let's remain open to questions. Let's remain inquirers, active inquirers, not just followers of people who have put themselves on a pedestal often and said, I know best, I know what's going on. Let's figure it out for ourselves. So that's the sort of key anthropological lesson that I took from my anthropological sub-career. And it applies everywhere in psychiatry. When we talk about disorders. Well, when I taught a little bit on that, I would read out the characteristics of personality disorder or narcissistic, whatever it might be, and ask who has ever experienced this feature, whatever it might be, suicidal thoughts, difficulties in relationships, and so on and so forth, sense of loss of reality. And everybody would put up their hands, including me. What makes it a disorder is the adjective that's applied to it, severe or extreme or something like that. And of course, that is defined culturally. That's cultural construction. And it's based on the norms of culture, which is why, it seems to me, if this rumor is true, in the latest edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Disorders, Psychiatric Disorders, narcissistic personality disorder was almost left out because it has become so normal. A norm is a normality. So this is cultural construction. And we really, really need to remember that. Because there's a tendency, I think, in humans to identify. Identity is fundamental to us, isn't it? But the trouble is, and identity is connected with belief and with priorities and with interests and with meanness and, whether it's individual or group narcissism, as Eric Fromm calls it in this book, The Heart of Man, which is its genius for good and evil. So he talks about group narcissism as being a great malaise, but that was in 1965. So when another area where this insight helped me was when I was teaching or started to teach education for sustainability back in 1995, and is a master's degree. And in 2002, I was asked to write a unit on culture in relation to sustainability. And I noticed that there were two types of students. There were those who were from a more scientific or technological background, and there were those from a more humanistic or social, even these terms are problematic, social science, right? Which tends to be lumped in with the humanities rather than with the sciences, because humans are so complex, right? Anyway, the people from a scientific and technological background, and notice, what is technology? Technology is the application of science to particular interests, to further particular interests. So it's therefore more cultural than scientific, more about what we want. And the scientific students would say things like, we know what the problem is. We scientifically know what the sustainability problems are, so it's obvious what we have to do. And the humanistic background students would say things like, it's terrible what's happening. We've got to do something about it. What I noticed was that neither of them were making the distinction between actually understanding what is happening and the opinions and the judgments about what we should be doing about it. It was this contrast between is and should. And around that time, I'd been speaking to somebody who worked for an oil multinational who was actually a friend, who was also a member of Greenpeace. And he pointed out how the same piece of scientific evidence can be interpreted and judged in quite different ways through the lenses of the interests of these different organizations. So I ended up writing a unit which I called Science and Culture in Education for Sustainability, to really highlight the importance of distinguishing these two ways of thinking. the way of thinking that seeks to describe, explain, with a view to understanding something, whether it's psychological or ecological or whatever it might be. So it's about what is, as far as we can get with our understanding. And cultural type thinking, which I'd now probably call more sort of ideological type thinking, which is about how do we apply what we found out to further particular interests. So it then highlights what are the interests, which then takes you into the social science domain of understanding, why do I have these beliefs? Why do I have these values? Why do I have these priorities and these interests? How do they impact on my behavior? And what impact does that behavior then have on others? So then we can look at, and this is thanks to an ecological anthropologist called Roy Rappaport, who is just brilliant. 2 books, Ecology, Meaning and Religion, and Ritual and Religion in the Making of Humanity, where he points out that if we take that sort of approach to cultural or ideological type thinking, we take a scientific type approach to it and ask, what does it do? How come we have those? We can reflect on it properly. Then we can ask which beliefs and which meanings that we live by are more functional in terms of maintaining the bigger system that we're part of. So it's systemic, it's ecosystemic. Placing meanings and values and all of that in the context of the ecosystem. That has given me such a solid foundation in my work and in my life, because I've also seen how in the sustainability field over decades, I think so much time has been lost by the conflation of these 2 types of thinking. We can't do them both at the same time. You try, just try for a moment. See if you can judge something and understand it at the same time. It can't be done. It's one or the other, but they can work together. You know, there's like sometimes talk about a scientific sandwich where, you know, an agenda is set by an interest. You then do the work of, well, what's actually happening here? You find the results and then you apply the results to whatever it is that you're wanting. So what sort of beliefs, meanings and values are actually functional in terms of maintaining the integrity of an ecosystem or actually contributing to its disintegration? Of course, the notion of levels, which is why I've got the Chinese boxes, Russian dolls. Which level are we actually talking about? You know, which level are we actually doing our analysis at? Because if as when I studied anthropology, the postmodernists and the constructivists are at that level, they always say quite rightly, any meaning, any belief is as valid as any other. And of course that's true at its own level in terms of itself. And Donald Trump brought out the shadow of this by saying, well, our beliefs are as valid as anyone else's beliefs. In fact, there is no knowledge, it's no science, there is only belief. And look what this has given rise to. But when you place a belief in the context of what it requires to exist, then you can start asking the question, which set of beliefs contributes to maintaining sustainability, whether it's ecological or social or psychological or others? That then changes the extent. You can then make an assessment as to how functional a particular belief is. And we know the beliefs we live by and solidly believe are destroying the world. And what are wars about? Well, yes, they're about identity. Which level is identity? Not sure. Which level is identity? Well, it's certainly part of a bigger system, isn't it? Today, well, let me come on to that in a minute. And wars are also about resource conflicts over resources, over how can we maintain our interests in really material terms. Another way that levels are important, I've nearly finished, haven't I? Today is Sunday. It's the Sabbath day. Ooh, we've forgotten all about that sort of thing, haven't we? I happened to be listening to Radio 4 this morning, and the Sunday worship was on. And the story for today, and as I say this, just notice, are any little prejudices creeping in? Are any little, oh, he's talking about religion. Ooh, no, don't want any of that. Which religion? That religion's all right, but maybe not that one. Just kind of notice how it happens, because prejudice means prejudging. That's what the word means. Notice it. I've noticed it. And for years, decades, I couldn't engage with that at all. But today, the story is about where Jesus is passing through Samaria, and he comes to a well, and he meets a Samaritan woman. Now, this was, 2,000 years ago. Samaritans and Jews Jews didn't talk to Samaritans. They'd done all sorts of unkosher things. They were sort of unkosher. But Jesus says, "Give me a drink." And she says, "But why are you asking me for a drink? You can't take a drink from me. I'm a Samaritan." And the story goes on. Now, that can be taken at a very literal level. It can also be taken at a symbolic level, because what he is eliciting is the distinction between the levels. Are we just give me a drink about wisdom? Give me some wisdom, and let's have an exchange of wisdoms. And so at one level, they're at loggerheads in their identities. At another level, he's saying, but actually, we're both human. And not just that she was a Samaritan, but that she was a woman as well. So this is also about levels. When are we talking about just something literal and ideological and identity-based? Or at what level are we identifying ourselves? Ask yourselves, what level of identity informs my life predominantly? And what other ones are there, perhaps in the background, perhaps in the context, which I kind of feel are really important, but I can't quite really enter into it in living yet. And that can be a challenge. Is it, I mean, what identity am I? I'm of mixed blood. So where do I identify? It just shows it's not about blood, it's about culture. I was born here, but my father went through horrendous racism. Am I a human? Am I a member of the ecosystem? All these different levels. So that's it, really. What is your in practice identity? How can you understand it? Why you've arrived at it? Why you can't perhaps move into other identities? And what is this distinction between the is and the should? And what's the interaction between them? I think I'll stop there. Thank you.